The Housewife's Library could be referred to as the 19th century equivalent to a modern-day home ec textbook. It is a compilation of various texts consisting of 9 different chapters, including domestic cookery, household management, home furnishing, home decoration, polite deportment, care of children, trying emergencies, games, amusements, and general hints, which covers all other snippets of information that don't fall seamlessly within one of the other distinct departments. Looking through the chapter entitled Domestic Cookery, one will find instructions and recipes for a variety of meals, including quotes like, "Good beef may be known by its color, that of a deep, healthy red, fine, smooth, open grain, veined with white, being the best." Quotes providing instructions for properly decorating a home can be found in home decoration, such as the following. The question of color arises here. On a dark background, white shows best. On an open background, the bronzes are best. The tone of the text generated from quotes like these is an informative one, seeking to provide a resource of useful information. This purpose is further confirmed within the preface of the book itself, stating, "It is believed that every housewife will find nothing here to neglect, but much to use and profit by. The housewives of America aspire to be the best things in their homes. This library will prove a splendid helper to their progress." Nevertheless, the nature of the book itself shows how fundamentally women were expected to be chefs, maids, teachers, nannies, interior designers, hosts, and nurses all at the same time. One of the biggest dilemmas when analyzing this text is determining if the true purpose for publishing a text like this was really to provide a tool for women to reference when needed, or if there is a more sinister underlying purpose such as the oppression of women.
This underlying oppressive tone can be deduced not only from the quotes contained within the book, but also from the physical attributes of the original copy. When looking at the outside cover of the book, there is nothing written except the title, which is rather perplexing because the author's name is typically found on the cover of the book they wrote. Opening up to the first page provided little more information about the publication of the book, but still never mentioned any authors, just the copywriter or editor, George A. Peltz, and the publisher, Hubbard Bros. Publishing. Knowing that this book is a compilation of various texts, yet there is no mention of any authors anywhere is suspicious. Through further investigation of similar works of this time, we found that this is not common. The Complete Housewife, written by Eliza Smith in 1727, published by J. Pemberton, and the Lady's Book of Etiquette and Manual of Politeness, written by Florence Hartley in 1860, published by W. Cortell Publishers, are both books that also contain information for teaching women about their place in society and acceptable social behaviors. The major difference between these two texts and the Housewife's Library is the notation of authors. While both of the other works were written by women for women, we cannot say for sure whether it was a man or woman who wrote the Housewife's Library. All 3 of the publishers mentioned thus far are known for predominantly publishing the work of male authors over females, which leads us to believe it was likely a man who wrote this book for women to read. The structural layout of this book includes a title page for each new chapter, followed by a page dedicated to a famous quote relative to the chapter, followed by an introductory paragraph explaining generally the type of information found within and how it is relevant before proceeding to the actual chapter itself. What's rather unusual about this in particular are the famous quotes the editor and publisher decided to include. Out of the 9 different quotes, 8 of them are from men, including Owen Meredith, Oliver Goldsmith, Clarence Cook, W.J. Lofty, James T. Field, Henry Longfellow, and Buffon, with only one being from a woman, Mrs. Jameson. In a book for women, it would seem more appropriate and empowering to include more quotes from actual women, especially if this book was written by women. Since this is not the case, it deepens our beliefs that this book was likely written by men for women.
This coupled with quotes like "housekeepers should be queens in every part of the home," or "speak of yourself as little as possible," or "the true lady does not condescend to scandal or gossip, does not profane her lips with slang words, does not yield to outbursts of temper, does not sacrifice modesty to fashion, does not turn a deaf ear to the voice of distress." This indicates there was some level of intended oppression from the author when writing this book. These are all quotes pulled directly from this book that show the expectations of housewives during this time. In fact, written right in the preface of the source itself is a distinction between a housekeeper and a housewife, and it states that the only difference between the two is a mere paycheck for a housekeeper, whereas a housewife is just expected to take on these duties as an obligation of their marriage. The incorporation of these quotes in the "you shouldn't do this" formation rather than the "you should do this" formation, shows how women were constantly told no, both literally and figuratively, in our nation's history. The Housewives Library appears to be a way for men to tell women how to act in accordance with their own personal standards and preferences.
Up until the 19th century, society was dominated in a patriarchal manner. Starting from a young age, males were raised in an education system that prepared them to provide economic prosperity to their families, whereas the education provided to females prepared them for properly socializing and completing household tasks. The accepted worldview during this time emphasized women's innate subordinate status to fathers, husbands, and other male authority figures. However, when it came to marriage, it was a mutual agreement, almost like a business deal. This is explicitly addressed within the preface of the Housewife's Library, saying, "A housewife is one wedded to the house and its interests. She is not a slave to the house, as a wife is not a slave to her husband. Both the man and the woman benefit from marriage equally, well, equal enough." The man was responsible for providing financial stability through working. The female was responsible for taking care of children in the house, as well as taking care of the man when he returned from work. It wasn't completely one-sided. In the Polite Deportment chapter of the Housewives Library, it says, "There is no reason why a husband should not treat his wife with exquisite politeness, why a wife should not remember that her husband has a claim to be treated like a gentleman, why the finest manners should not be observed by brothers and sisters. This mutual courtesy, inspired by mutual love, would purify the atmosphere of home and invest with a new dignity in our domestic relations. This shows that women were not forced into marriage and treated like servants, but instead shows that partners in marriage were to treat each other with respect. Each knew their place and responsibilities."
The Housewives Library was published in 1883, which falls between the time of the Civil War and Industrial Revolution era and the start of World War I, both of which were time periods that had significant effects on American societal practices. The Industrial Revolution is typically cited as spanning from around the 1760s to the 1840s, and prior to this time, the typical jobs in America were agricultural, and more specifically farming. A typical workday lasted from sunup to sundown, so roughly 12 hours a day, with longer and harder working seasons from late spring to early fall. Still, the men would be in close proximity to the home so that they could help the women out when needed. And resulting from the Industrial Revolution was the implementation of factories and assembly line jobs. This was a major shift because now the men had to leave the home for 10 to 12-hour workdays up to 6 days a week. And then in 1869, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, which was a major technological advancement for the United States stemming from the Industrial Revolution. It provided a way to connect the East to the West and allowed for quick and efficient transport of both people and goods across the nation, which is likely how this book was distributed. The American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, and upon the conclusion of the war was the emancipation of slavery for the African American race. And this was an eye-opener for white America, and many people don't typically think of it like this, but in particular, white women were drastically affected by the change in society. Young white females in middle-class slave-owning houses were often presented with a slave woman of their own to accompany them throughout life. This slave was essentially a personal servant to these women, taking care of all of their household duties upon marriage and childbirth. So now white women were forced to relieve their servants of these duties and take them on themselves, which was rather difficult because they had never previously had to perform any of these tasks before, and they didn't always know how. This is where the Housewives Library comes into play. It provided these ignorant women with easy-to-read and easy-to-understand instructions so that they may be a successful housewife for their husbands, supporting the idea that this book was published for informative purposes.
The conclusion of the Civil War also aided in adding to the inequality observed between men and women in the 19th century in terms of voting rights. The war ended in 1865 with emancipation of slavery and resulted in the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1870, a mere 5 years later. This amendment granted African American men the right to vote and declared that no man in the United States shall be denied this right based on race of color. So men who were seen as chattel and property only a few years prior were granted new opportunities, whereas women of any race or color were disregarded and excluded. About 4 decades later, the United States joined in the First World War from 1914 to 1918, which resulted in millions of men being sent overseas to fight. This left women behind to pick up the work in the factories, which was a big shift from the jobs available to them previously, aka working in the house. Women refused to return back to the home after the war and started to fight for their equality in a movement known as women's suffrage. Women started being admitted into colleges and universities and they even started to dominate some fields in the workforce such as teaching, nursing, secretary work, and phone operators. It wasn't until 1920 that the 19th Amendment was ratified, providing women the right to vote alongside their male counterparts.
So while it is easy to see how this book could be a valuable resource for women of the time, it is also easy to see how this book played a role in women's oppression and helped spark the women's suffrage movement. Based on the different quotes located within, the utter disregard for author notation, as well as the time periods leading up to and following its publication, it is left up to the reader interpretation as to which of these was the true purpose of this book. Was it a way to remind women that their place is in the home, and these were the guidelines for what was expected of them? Or was it a way for women to have a collection of a variety of information all in the same place for them to easily access? We say it is likely a mix of both of these, with the oppressive tone lurking from the shadows of the ever-prominent informative tone.